I believe we're ready. Dear fathers, dear friends of the Volos Academy for Theological Studies, welcome once again to this series of lectures, Time for Action. Today's panel is very interesting. It is about academic freedom in Orthodoxy, ecclesiastical authority and academic freedom in Orthodoxy. As usually, when somebody else is moderating, I'm just giving a welcoming speech and then I give the floor to the moderator. Today, we are honored because the moderator is my dear friend, Dr. Assad Elias Katan, professor of Orthodox Theology at Münster University. And I'm now giving him the floor to present our speakers and the topic of today's lecture. I will take the floor again later on during my speech. Dear Assad, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to moderate today's lecture. The floor to you.
Many thanks, dear Pandelius. I'm actually honored to be a moderator this evening. Let me start by welcoming you all in this live webinar or a digital roundtable. Well, the table is not here, but you have to imagine it a little bit. As Pandelius already mentioned, my name is Assad Elias Katan. I'm a professor of Orthodox theology at the Center for Religious Studies at the University of Münster in Germany, and I shall be moderating this panel on ecclesiastical authority and academic freedom in Orthodoxy. As you all know, the question of the relationship between church authority and academic theological freedom is not a new one. It's actually an old question, yet it has become more crucial over the recent years against the background of regrettable developments in Serbia, where a number of professors, colleagues lost their permission or their right even to teach at the Belgrade University. We can also register attempts at controlling the freedom of theological thought in Romania and Russia too, as well as in other Orthodox contexts. In the Middle East, for example, a number of critical theological voices felt somehow compelled to leave the theological faculty of St. John of Damascus in Balamand in Lebanon. We are grateful to the Volos Academy for Theological Studies for organizing this roundtable on this very crucial, very important issue. Today, we have 4 speakers, Mrs. Inga Leonova, Dr. Ionut Bilyuta, Dr. Milan Vukomanovic, and Dr. Pandelis Kalaizivis. We are going to follow the following order. We are starting with Mrs. Leonova and then proceeding to Professor Vukomanovic, unlike the alphabetical order, because the case of Serbia is extremely important, and then Ionut Bilyuta, and last but not least, at the very end, Pandelis Kalaizivis. Mrs. Inga Leonova is a practicing architect and educator and founder and editor-in-chief of The Wheel, a quarterly journal of Orthodox thought and culture. Her primary academic interests include theology of sacred space, practice of ecclesial architecture, and matters of Christian anthropology. Dear Inga, you have the floor. All participants and listeners are kindly requested to switch off their microphones and cameras.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Hello, good time of day to all of you. The topic of my paper is Ecclesial Authority and Academic Freedom in Russia in 2023, although the proper title would unfortunately be Ecclesial Authority and Academic Freedom under Fascism. This presentation is an update to the talk given at the Volus Academy panel at the conference of the European Academy of Religion in 2021. I would refer those who are interested in some of the introductory information on the concept of academic freedom in Russia and the development of theological education after the collapse of the Soviet Union to that paper. In the space of only 2 years that have passed since that previous panel, the context of all academic institutions, including institutions of theological education, has become singular, and that context is Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm sure that it is not news to anyone here that Russian Orthodox Church, in the persons of its primate, episcopate, and most of the clergy, has not only allied itself with Putin's regime and its aggression against Ukraine, but has eagerly embraced the social commission for providing this war with an ideological basis. It is perhaps unnecessary to rehash the statements made by Patriarch Kirill, his bishops, and his most notorious clergy since the very first days of the full military aggression in 2022. Suffice it to say that it began with a very bizarre suggestion that the Russian state is commanded by God to prevent the spray of gay parades into the traditional Orthodox lands, and that the war therefore has a metaphysical dimension, and proceeded into openly heretical statements about the absolution of sins of soldiers who die in battle. Everyone with access to Google can enjoy the texts for themselves, including accessing my own papers in which I liberally quote from primary sources. The subject of today's talk is the effect this official position of the Russian Church has on the institutions of higher theological learning, as well as the life in the parishes. Let me begin by noting that since February 24th, 2022, the level of self-censorship has taken unprecedented forms which surpass even those familiar to people who, like me, grew up in the Soviet Union. Essentially, no one talks about anything at all outside the very narrow, trustworthy circles. In the very first days of the war, almost 300 clergy signed an open letter decrying the aggression and demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. Within days, several of the signatories in the employ of the various structures of Moscow Patriarchate have been fired from their jobs. Some of the clergy disciplined and others left the country. This was the first time that the repressions against the clergy protesting the actions of the government have been so swift and widespread. It sent an unmistakable signal that the official church was no longer in the mood for tolerating any kind of dissent. Since that letter, the persecutions against any type of anti-war or simply irenic voices among the clergy have not only taken a systematic form, but furthermore, there have been cases of church authorities denouncing the dissident clergy to the civil ones for persecution. A Belarusian website called Christians Against the War keeps a list called Persecution of Christians by Religious and State Authorities for Anti-War Stance of Support of Ukraine. This list contains over 30 names of clergy whose stories are public. The anecdotal evidence suggests that more than twice this number have been disciplined in some way, and a couple of dozen clergy have left Russia to escape persecution. Let me recount just a couple of the more notorious cases. The first is that of Igumen Arseny Sokolov, a well-known biblical scholar and a representative of the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia to the Patriarch of Antioch and all the East. He was the first signatory of the clergy appeal. On the 28th of March, he launched a Telegram channel where he wrote, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." A quote from Isaiah 5. "Woe to those who call a fratricidal war a peacekeeping operation." He also wrote that, in his opinion, prayer for the glory of Russia or for any other country and not for the glory of God is simply idolatry. On 29th of March, he was forced to delete his earlier channel entries. He noted that the motherland is being driven into a camp. So far, this is just a colony settlement, but it seems that a general regime will be introduced soon, followed by a strict regime, and so on. Who will we, the pastors of the church, be in this camp? Prisoners or guards? This message was also deleted. Instead, a quote from the prophet Amos about the need for silence appeared, and soon after that, the channel became unavailable. On 27th of May, Higumen Arseni was dismissed from the post of the representative of the Moscow Patriarch to the Patriarch of Antioch. Commenting on the request of the church authorities to offer a special prayer for Vladimir Putin in honor of his birthday, Sokolov wrote on his Facebook page on October 6, "One should not pray for Tsar Herod." On November 1st, 2022, Vakhtang Khipshidze, deputy head of the Synodal Department for Relations of the Church with Society and the Media, in an interview with the RTVI channel, accused the clergy who signed the appeal of the priests of the Russian Orthodox Church against the war of trying to, and I quote, introduce into the church territory the conflict that the church has no relations with, end of quote. Khipshidze recalled that the European Parliament referred to the appeal in the special resolution on Russia, and the federal president of Germany, Walter Steinmeier, at the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Karlsruhe. He described the appeal as opposition activity, a manifestation of disloyalty to the state and the assistance to unfriendly Western forces. Quote, "Magically, this began to be used by those political forces that, as we have all seen in recent months, do not wish any good to our country and our people," end of quote. On November 10th, Higumen Arseni announced the release of his translation of the book of the prophet Micah with his own commentaries. The book is known for the anti-militarist statement, "They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." Micah 4. On November 11th, 2022, it became known that Higumen Arseni was dismissed from the General Church Postgraduate and Doctoral School, where he used to be head of the Department of Biblical Studies. Another example is Maxim Kolinin, the theologian, linguist, and researcher of the Mesopotamian Christian mystical tradition, Life and Works of East Syrian Mystics. He spoke out against the war with Ukraine in his social networks, called for peace and peacemaking, and criticized church-state relations and support for authoritarian and dictatorial regimes in his lectures and public speeches. On the 16th of December, 2022, he was dismissed from the Old Church Postgraduate and Doctoral Studies of the Russian Orthodox Church without explanation. Another case is that of proto-presbyter Andrei Kordychkin, rector of the Russian Orthodox parish in Madrid, and one of the most outspoken critics of the war and the Russian state policies. He has been suspended and subsequently forbidden to give public talks. The most notorious recent case was that of priest Ioan Koval in Moscow, whose offense was to replace the word victory with the word peace in the prayer for Holy Rus. Instead of "Arise, O God, to help your people and give us victory by your power," he was saying, "Arise, O God, to help your people and give us peace by your power." His own altar server, a position where government snitches are traditionally installed in Russia, reported the priest to the authorities. The hierarchy regarded his actions as a manifestation of unruliness. On February the 2nd, a decree on the dismissal of Reverend Koval from priestly ministry, signed by Patriarch Kirill, was published on the Moscow Diocese website. On May 11th, 2023, a session of the Moscow Diocesan Court was held, at which Reverend Ioan Koval was defrocked for violation of priestly vows. And lastly, of course, everyone knows about the recent defrocking of the dissident proto-deacon of all Rus, Andrei Kuraev, who for several years had been an outspoken critic of Patriarch Kirill and recently a staunch anti-war activist. Under these circumstances, it becomes, I think, fairly obvious that there can be no longer any meaningful discussion of any form of academic freedom in any theological institutions, or indeed any institutions of higher learning. However, in the interest of keeping record, I would like to briefly touch on the situation in some of the main Russian theological schools that I have surveyed before. Moscow Theological Academy is currently the main hotbed of what is known as Z activism and Orthodox Z theology. And just to explain the terminology, the letter Z, following the invasion into Ukraine, has become the symbol of war and all pro-war activities, actually an official symbol of the war against Ukraine. So when I say Z activism, I mean pro-war activism. The rector of MTA, Kirill Zinkovsky, chair of the Theological Commission of Moscow Patriarchate, is a relative moderate himself. However, both the commission and the academy are extremely active in rather inept attempts at developing the theology or the ideology of the Holy War, which so far has not achieved even the level of such luminaries as the notorious American archpriest Alexander Webster, the chief hawk of the just war theory. One of the primary activists in the academy is one Alexander Timofeyev, chair of the Department of Biblical Studies, who in the fall of 2022 traveled to Donbass and defended a doctoral dissertation in the Lugansk University, which is about an academic equivalent of the University of Phoenix in the United States, or otherwise a correspondence course. However, he came back to Moscow with this sham degree, which nevertheless was enough for his installation as a department chair. St. Petersburg Theological Academy presents an opposite case. Its rector, Bishop Siluan Nikitin from Sretinsky Theological Academy, is a true Z activist of Tikhon Shevkunov's mold. However, the rest of the academy is relatively inert and does not quite produce the kind of theological propaganda that comes out of its Moscow counterpart. After the departure of Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev from Moscow, and therefore the rectorship of the General Church Postgraduate and Doctoral School, this position has been given to Archpriest Maxim Kozlov, former rector of Sretinsky Theological Academy and chair of the Department of Theological Education. Kozlov bears significant responsibility for the general stagnation of theological education in Russia and continues to make public overtures to demonstrate his patriotism and loyalty to the Patriarchate. However, much to everyone's surprise, he has hired several of the signatories of the clergy appeal to various teaching positions at the school, beginning with Higumen Arseny Sokolov, under the condition of complete public silence. If these conditions are violated, however, he would not defend his charges, as has been demonstrated in the case of the aforementioned Higumen Arseny. Still, the academic situation in the school is tolerable, especially after the dismissal of its deputy rector Shmonin, a notorious obscurantist. The second category of places of theological education, theological departments of the secular academic institutions, have continued their intellectual freefall and merit no mention. As for the third category, which I described 2 years ago, as schools where serious and promising theological education has taken root, the progressive institutes, such as the Higher School of Economics, the European University, and Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, Shaninka, their situation has changed completely because the majority of their theological and not only theological faculty has left Russia after the beginning of the war. Sergei Zuev, rector of Shaninka, was arrested in late 2021 on the sham charges of embezzlement. He spent over half a year in prison in spite of his very poor health, and was eventually dismissed from his position. Many of the faculty left the country, fearing imminent arrest, and the departments of theological studies have essentially ceased to exist. To summarize, the official task of public theology in Russia these days is the ideological service of the war. As I mentioned before, those efforts have not yet produced anything even of negative merit worthy of engagement. Quite recently, a notorious ideologue of Russian fascism, Alexander Dugin, held a live stream panel, Russian Theology of War, which included Archbishop Sava Tutunov, one of the architects of the reunification of the Russian Exarchate in Europe with the Moscow Patriarchate, and the aforementioned Alexander Timofeyev from Moscow Theological Academy. According to Professor Andrei Shishkov, a well-known theologian, any attempts to formulate the theology that took over 2 hours failed to produce anything coherent. Dugin has offered a concept which was mostly Manichaean and required a second God, while the current special military operation, according to him, had a cosmic character of war against the devil himself. Tutunov spent most of his time discussing the martyrdom of the soldiers whose sacrifice consists of murdering their own souls through the killing. Generally, just like the Gnostic heresies of their primate, Russian church ideologues seem to be able only to regurgitate Gnostic apocalyptic imagery and declare the absolute primacy of the Russian way without any logical or comprehensible substantiation. Such is the current state of affairs in the Russian church, which in my opinion is long overdue for the conciliar denunciation by the Orthodox oikumena. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga Leonova, for your very informative input. We go on to our second speaker, Professor Milan Vukomanovic. He is full professor of sociology of religion at the Faculty of Philosophy of the University of Belgrade. Professor Vukomanovic, his academic interests range from sociology of religion and interreligious dialogue to studies of early Christianity, Orthodox Church, and Islam. Professor Vukomanovic, you have the word.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katan. As announced previously, my presentation is dealing with the recent controversies related to the issue of ecclesiastical authority and academic freedom at the Faculty of Orthodox Theology, University of Belgrade. For that purpose, I will use the abbreviations FOT for the Faculty of Theology and UB for the University of Belgrade, because these words will probably appear a couple of dozen times in my presentation. So until recently, the Serbian Orthodox Church, an institution separated from the state by the Constitution of Serbia, has not interfered too much in the academic activity of the state-owned Faculty of Orthodox Theology. A kind of modus vivendi maintained that very delicate institutional affiliation. However, this balance was disturbed in 2019 and 20 when 3 professors, namely Bishop Maxim Vasiljevich, Marko Vilotic, and Rodoljub Kubat, were first suspended and then fired primarily because of their public appearances and theoretical viewpoints that were opposed by the Holy Synod. As university teachers, the state guaranteed those professors full freedom to express their scholarly ideas and conceptions, as well as ethical principles, both in faculty halls and in the general public. Soon after, the issue of incompatibility of the FOT statute with the UB statute and the law on higher education in Serbia was opened wide. Namely, it became clear that the aforementioned professors were dismissed outside the regular university procedures and norms, and that their human rights were also violated. Some of them are still litigating before the state courts. Bearing all that in mind, it is clear why the administration in the fall of 2019, I mean UB, university administration, even before the dismissal of the 3 professors, raised the issue of the incongruity of the FOT statute with the UB statute, with the intention of finally resolving this legal problem at the university. Among other things, the Statutory Council of the UB referred to the violation of a series of statutory and legal norms in regard to the relations between the Synod and the FOT. However, the Synod and FOT completely ignored the recommendations of the University Rectorate. On the initiative of the UB Rector, a university working group was then formed with the aim of helping the FOT in harmonizing their statute with the university statute. A 5-member working group whose task was to overcome the problem of inconsistency between the provisions of the current FOT statute and the UB statute dealt with that disputed matter in the period from October 2020 to March 21. At the end of its mandate, the working group, with the exception of Professor Porfirie Peric, the current patriarch, fully supported the majority opinion of the Committee for Statutory Issues of the UB that the concept of blessing, that is the consent of the bishops and the Holy Synod, is in contradiction with the law and the statute of the University of Belgrade, which is, of course, a state institution, and all the faculties within that family are state faculties, including the Faculty of Orthodox Theology. It is clear that for the UB academic community, the most expedient way to solve the problem of legality of the work of the FOT, as well as any other faculty, was to harmonize the FOT statute with the UB statute and the then valid law on higher education concerning the following academic procedures: the approval of a bishop for study enrollment and applying for a teaching position, and approval of the Holy Synod for teaching service of an FOT professor. That relatively minor problem of inconsistency between the 2 statutes was unfortunately resolved, as it were, in a Solomonic fashion in 2021 by causing a much bigger problem: the adoption of the new law on higher education, which clearly contradicts the Constitution of the Republic of Serbia. In the legal order of the Republic of Serbia, until the passing of this law in 2021, there was no constitutional, legal, or statutory basis for the introduction of the concept of blessing, or missio canonica, into the autonomous law of UB, including FOT. As is well known, missio canonica is a specifically Roman Catholic concept, and the basis for its inclusion in a national law could be a concordat signed with the Vatican, as for example in the case of Germany and Croatia, which the Republic of Serbia never signed. Moreover, if such an international agreement existed, the question is whether it could have been applied to FOT, given that it is a faculty where the theology of another Christian denomination is studied. However, the 2021 law on higher education fully opened the door for SOC to decide on student enrollment, as well as on application, selection, and even dismissal of professors at FOT. Such provisions were only valid between 1952 and 2004, when FOT was under the full jurisdiction of the Serbian Church and not a member of the University of Belgrade. Namely, in 1952, by decision of the Yugoslav Socialist government, FOT was removed from UB and thus came under the jurisdiction of the Holy Synod, which took over the ownership rights over FOT, renaming it into Theological Faculty of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Now, instead of the FOT being statutorily harmonized with other UB faculties, the autonomy of the UB was seriously infringed. From 2021 onwards, the Serbian Church, a non-university and non-state institution, has been allowed to legally supervise the enrollment of students and the selection and dismissal of the state university teachers. The fact that a non-university institution with the support of the Ministry of Education violated the university's autonomy is no longer only a problem for the FOT, but also for the state or Belgrade University. Because the provisions of the 2021 law are in conflict with the Constitution and some fundamental academic norms of the UB, valid since its establishment in the early 19th century. The new law on higher education is not in accordance with the Constitution of Serbia in the provisions that foresee the consent of church authorities for study enrollment, participation in a teacher's application process, establishment of employment, and loss of position, that is termination of employment at FOT. Considering the principle of secularity of the state and the strict legal distinction of church and state valid in Serbia, as well as the guaranteed autonomy of university, which would be infringed if any non-university body had influence on the enrollment of students and the selection of teachers, it follows that the Constitution was directly violated in the provision guaranteeing the autonomy of universities, Article 72 of the Constitution. When it comes to the interpretation of constitutional norms and principles, the Constitutional Court in Serbia could, for example, assess the constitutionality or legality of the 2021 law on higher education, especially with regard to protecting the autonomy of universities, the freedom of scientific and artistic creation, the secularity of the state, and the right to a legal remedy. All these articles are included in the current constitution. Finally, the religious and academic freedoms are expressed by the full freedom of the theology professors to present their own theoretical and theological philosophical ideas, concepts, and interpretations that do not violate the boundaries of possible heterodoxy and can represent a contribution to the development of theology and encouragement for dialogue both with representatives of one's own religion and with colleagues from other confessional backgrounds and traditions. Orthodox theology at FOT is shaped, taught, and designed in terms of the curricula by professors of Orthodox theology. The prelates who assemble in the Holy Synod are not necessarily, nor as a rule, Orthodox theologians. They are the higher clergy looking after the dioceses and the church as a whole, but they are not in charge of the Orthodox theology programs. First of all, they do not have appropriate academic competencies. Among those bishops, there are admittedly some theologians with professorial titles, but the number of them in the composition of the synod is much smaller, and most often they're not in that body at all. All this is a bit like the difference between lawyers in high positions in the judiciary and law professors. Law professors make curricula and programs at the Faculty of Law, but judges of the Constitutional Court, for example, do not do this, although one can find some law professors among them. But even those judges propose and adopt, together with their colleagues, the plans and programs of the Faculty of Law as professors of that faculty and not as judges of the Constitutional Court. When it comes to teaching at FOT, all the professors who teach there are, as a rule, theologically trained Orthodox believers, and some of them are also priests or archpriests, so they would not even be expected to present something contrary to Orthodox teachings. Taking over the powers of the Holy Synod of the FOT curricula could further generate a series of professional and practical problems, such as those that the UB has faced since May 2017, when a group of even 12 theology professors, including a bishop, signed a statement in reaction to the petition of Serbian creationists. Interestingly enough, these creationists did not come from religious turf. They were mainly doctors and other professionals. Among other things, they claimed that there was no plausible alternative scientific theory that could replace the theory of evolution. This was the position of our theologians. Moreover, those theologians advocated the position that there was no biblical theory of creation that could be understood as a scientific theory, that is, a scientific alternative to the theory of evolution. Their announcement was met with a very negative reaction from the Holy Synod. Shortly after the conclusion of the Holy Council of Bishops in May 2017, some teachers with priestly titles were denied main duties in the parishes and were only allowed to co-serve in liturgies. Others were dismissed from the editorial offices of the SOC electronic and print media, and that decision was made personally by the late Patriarch Irene. At the same time, he forbade as many as 5 professors to make public statements in the future without his blessing. All of this was accompanied by a warning that church disciplinary proceedings would be initiated against those who break that rule. To conclude, in the period from 2019 to 2021, even 3 theologians were deprived of the teaching positions at the FOT for reasons similar to those that caused the unusually strict sanctions of the church leadership in 2017. The adoption of the new state law on higher education, instead of having the favorable effect on the identity, doctrine, and perception of the Serbian Orthodox Church, has only paved the way for new purges at FOT and the dying out of those voices in Serbian Orthodox theology were able to recognize the signs of the times. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Vukomanovic, for your speech. Our third speaker is Ionut Biliuta. He's a historian and theologian and works as a researcher with the Sinkai Institute, which is affiliated to the Romanian Academy. His main academic interests are the history of the Orthodox Church in the 20th century, with a particular attention to the Romanian and Greek Orthodox cases. Dr. Biliuta, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Catan. It's so nice to be here. I will read my paper. I hope not very fast. So, my paper sounds like this. In 2007, when Metropolitan Daniel Ciobotea, born in 1951, became the sixth patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church, the theological and priestly milieus were brimming with expectation. A respected scholar of systematic theology with degrees obtained in the West, an ecumenical theologian, a diplomat of the Church, he was the obvious choice for succeeding the old and beleaguered patriarch Teoctist Arăpașu. He died in 2007. Being the spiritual leader of one of the most significant Orthodox churches was no easy task in post-communist Romania. The Patriarchate faced a wide range of dilemmas, such as cohabitation in a democratic state and with an increasing unsympathetic civil society. Countless voices criticized over the 1990s and the early 2000s the lack of repentance from the Orthodox clergy for their collaboration with the communist regime, their undercover activity with the ill-famed Securitate among their parishioners, and their subsequent reluctance in publicly acknowledging their ties with the communist dictatorship. The Patriarchate displayed the same unrepentant silence regarding its moral responsibility for the nefarious role of the Orthodox clergymen in the Holocaust, their accommodation of fascist ideology during the interwar and post-war years, and their role in the exploitations of the Roma slaves before the half of the 19th century. Social challenges such as steady secularization of the public sphere, the lack of international visibility of Orthodox theologians, and the migration of clerical and theological vocations to the secular realm caught the better part of the central administration unprepared. The bishops were confronted with a series of highly specific, including purely regional and personal problems of their own. The growing rate of divorces among the priests, the promotions in the ecclesiastical administration of yes men rather than spirited and intellectually gifted clerics, the absence of a critical theological spirit, and the inability to speak freely in the church, all of these are now among the critical issues looming over Romanian Orthodox communities. Using his ability and negotiating skills with the state, Patriarch Daniel steered the church through several public scandals, charges of pedophilia directed against bishops and priests, the persistence of medieval rituals of exorcism that led to the death of a young nun at Tanacu Monastery, the public contestation of Patriarch Daniel's legitimacy after the collective tragedy. Increased institutional control best describes Patriarch Daniel's tenure in the leading see of the Romanian Orthodoxy. Gaining admission in a theological school, a promotion on the ladder of the Orthodox Church, access to an administrative position in the university, for example, as head of department, the bureaucracy of the church, or getting a job in the theological system requires a mandatory blessing from the local bishop. Lately, the Holy Synod decreed that episcopal blessings had to be renewed at the beginning of every academic year for every member of the Orthodox faculty and would depend on the professor's behavior, public presence in the media, or basically his public absence in the media, or what rumors might reach the overconfident ears of the bishop and his administration. Academic performance hardly constitutes one of the criteria taken into consideration by the bishops when issuing such blessings. From a formality emanating from the spiritual paternity of every bishop to any member of his flock, the episcopal blessing has turned over the last years into a bureaucratic tool of controlling the opinions and curbing the academic independence of Orthodox theologians. In contemporary Romania, the bishop decides which topics are the best to be pursued or not by theologians, which conferences and workshops theologians can attend, in which academic societies in Romania and abroad the Romanian Orthodox theologian can belong to, how the history of the Romanian Orthodox Church should be written. The keys of the historical truth and the new theological avenues to be pursued were placed in the hands of the bishops, who, with a few exceptions, due to their intellectual inability, are in no position to supervise theological production or historical research. Furthermore, the bishops advise theologians regarding what publications and journals they are allowed to speak or publish in which outlets or publishing houses, preferably those of the Orthodox Church, are allowed to publish their work. The episcopal authority over the theological system determined the rapid and dramatic change in the Orthodox theologian's mindset and academic behavior. With a very few but notable exceptions, most theologians hired in the departments of Orthodox theology prove the axiom proposed by the renowned British sociologist of religion, Grace Davy: to survive the episcopal pressure exerted daily and by all means possible, Orthodox theologians believe in the system of servitude, seeking the goodwill of their bishops above their ecclesiastical and academic freedom. Alternatively, they belong to the system due to their intellectual détente and vocation without believing that they must serve at the bishop's pleasure, and therefore refusing to vouch for obedience towards the all-knowing bishops. With many of the members of the faculties, the bishops use blackmail, veiled threats, spiritual advice, and authoritarian majesty. If a bishop dislikes one professor of any rank or his opinions, he can just withdraw the blessing from the personal file of the professor and leave him unemployed. The most effective use of the episcopal blessing to ensure academic obedience and conformity towards the bishop in the theological system relates to a form of silent blackmail. Every professor of theology knows that bishops have no problems withdrawing these pieces of paper bearing their signatures from their personnel files. Hardly selected for any outstanding intellectual competence and always afraid of becoming unsavory for the local hierarch, theologians choose silence when confronted with episcopal abuses instead of free speech and obedience to their bishop rather than academic performance. Admission in the academic theological system presupposes the candidate to father as many children as possible, therefore pushing the hand of his bishop to hire him as a charity case. An obedient wife with a career subservient to that of her husband, the confession of sins to a famous spiritual father, well seen by the bishop, performing menial jobs within the department, the ecclesiastical administration, or serving as the bishop's secretary until the right position opens, and the ability to smear the potential competition. If the contra candidate for such a position has studied abroad in a secular or heteroorthodox university, failed to perform his regular years of servitude, or to pay lip to the personality cult orchestrated around the bishop by the academics and clergymen alike, she is labeled as a Sorosist, a Freemason, an ecumenist, an apostate, or someone who secretly converted to Judaism. No diatribe against his intellectual ability or defamation directed against him, her, or her family is enough to determine the potential competition to drop her application for the position in question. No wonder that most admissions for teaching positions in the theological system patronized by the Romanian universities, have only one competitor who knows in advance from his bishop or the professor she replaces, and who was also her doctoral supervisor, both the topic of examination and its outcome. When displeased beyond measure with the bishop's increasing authoritarianism or wanting to pursue their true vocation, the Orthodox theologian has only two options available. Either he resigns and leaves for Western Europe, hoping for a good parish in the Romanian bishoprics in the diaspora and an eventual new academic job there, or he quits the Orthodox academia altogether. Even in this bleak context, there were several spaces of dissent and mouths of fresh air provided by the ecumenical movement and intellectual outlets such as the New Europe College Institute for Advanced Studies located in Bucharest, or the Center for Ecumenical Research located in Sibiu. While New Europe College is a private research institution with a vast range of academic interests and housing a multitude of scholars, the Center of Ecumenical Research in Sibiu was until 2021 a joint venture of the Orthodox and Lutheran departments of theology from Lucian Blaga University in Sibiu. The center, with its multi-confessional team of researchers, among them Orthodox, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, embarked on challenging projects, such as the liturgical reflection of anti-Semitism in Orthodox hymnography, or the social and religious integration of the Roma, with the sole purpose of breathing a fresh wave of air into the obtuse theological system. The center also published and still publishes one of the most respectable and scholarly theological journals in Romania, known as the Review of Ecumenical Studies Sibiu, that received the highest score for a theological journal from the evaluating body of the Romanian state. The final straw that signaled an even more radicalized and authoritarian church was drawn in August 2021, when an internal decision of the Holy Synod in Bucharest chastised the Center for the Ecumenical Research in Sibiu for a research project funded by the Norwegian and Romanian national grants that intended to study the integration of the Roma community in Romania over the last few centuries with the help of the Orthodox Church, a sensitive issue in the pre-modern history of the Romanian Orthodoxy, since Orthodox monasteries and bishoprics from medieval time until the mid-19th century were dependent on Roma slave labor. The research project team, composed of Lutheran, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox theologians, focused chiefly on the beneficial role played by the Orthodox Church in the past and current efforts of the Church for the social integration of the Roma community. The internal decision of the bishops had repercussions over the Institute's very existence. The Orthodox priests hired in the project and in the Institute were summoned at the Orthodox Archbishopric in Sibiu and threatened to choose between their job at the center or defrocking. Furthermore, the local Orthodox Department of Theology's representatives withdrew from the center and through backward channels asked the Lucian Blaga University to dissolve the center. Due to increased pressure and threats from the Orthodox ecclesiastical authorities in Sibiu over the team of researchers, one of the center employees had a cardiorespiratory stop and she nearly died. The Western reader should perceive the decision of the Holy Synod in Bucharest as the final subjugation of the theological system by the authority of the bishops. To paraphrase one Latin father of the Church, Saint Cyprian of Carthage, there is no freedom for Romanian theologians outside their bishop's will. In addition, according to the decision, no clergyman or theologian will be able to participate in research projects, professional associations, ecumenical endeavors, or conferences without the blessing of their ruling bishop. Furthermore, in order to attend events and conferences abroad or be co-opted as a member in a research grant, the clergyman or the theologian now needs the blessing of the patriarch himself. For example, a theologian first submits an official request to his bishop for permission to participate in a conference. The bishop approves or not the form, writes a favorable or an unfavorable report, and forwards these materials to the patriarchal administration, where the patriarch or the synod decides if the request should be granted. Afterward, the bishop receives the decision, co-signs it, sends it back to the candidate. The whole process can last weeks, if not months on end. The decision of the Holy Synod curtails all academic freedom and determines an even tighter dependency of the theologians from their bishops. In this instance, no theological dialogue or ecumenical undertaking will be possible in the future without the agreement and mediation of the bishops, and especially the patriarchal administration. Although such a decision contradicts several constitutional and even the most elementary civil rights, the decision of the Holy Synod, passed in August 2021, signals an even more conservative and authoritarian behavior of the bishops over the theological system. The mentality of the hierarchy, unable to accept constructive criticism from the public sphere, depicts the church as constantly under siege of occult forces, with the sole purpose of destroying it. Such a counterproductive attitude ensured the isolation of the Orthodox faculty in the university and the academic world. It also causes a slowly but surely failure into mediocrity of the theological education system at all levels. With the laity and the theologians pushed in a corner, the priesthood overburdened with financial duties, and the monasticism reduced to a vegetative state, it seems the hierarchy has succeeded in controlling all the component layers of the Romanian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Daniel or the bishops could not deter through the power of their words or their seldom public apparitions the wave of discontent in the Orthodox communities. Instead, the bishops keep their silence and stall for time. Overburdened with taxes and waves of forced fundraisers that squeeze the last out of the parishes to salvage the tainted public image of the church, exposed by the media as one of the largest private institutions that beneficiated from state funding, Orthodox theologians focused on their own interest and the preservation of their own parishes. Pastoral duties performed solely, and in many cases out of pecuniary interest, took precedence to sheer obedience towards the bishops and meddling in the intestine problems of the Orthodox Church. Retaining their lifestyle and their steady income, the theologians continue to contribute to the urbanistic project of the central and local administrations because they know that money always trumps competence. Instead of envisaging the Orthodox clergy based on a meritocratic structure that dwells on academic performance and pastoral activism, a Romanian Orthodox theologian would always prefer to pay good money for his promotion instead of a true meritocracy based on intellectual and pastoral performance. Furthermore, progress in theology and pastoral mission of the church would ensure that priests should care more about their pastoral duties. Bishops should learn to tend about their spiritual responsibilities in a spirit of love and collegiality with priests and laity of the church, and theologians should pursue their academic interests with impunity. Without freedom of expression and creativity, theology remains a questionable venture at best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Biliuta, for your provocative talk. We come now to our fourth and last speaker, Pandelis Kalaizivis, who is a systematic theologian and has been the director of the Voros Academy for Theological Studies since 2000. Pandelis' academic interests include, among others, dialogue between orthodoxy and modernity, religious nationalism and fundamentalism, political theology, and issues in general, and issues of renewal and reform in Eastern Orthodoxy. Pandelis, you have the floor.
Thank you, dear Katan, for the presentation, for the introduction. Θα μιλήσω ελληνικά.
Yeah, I will switch into Greek. I believe that the only word that can describe what we've already heard is shocking and scandalous. And with my speech, I will seek to explain what lies in the background, the theological background of all the experiences shared so far. In recent years, in the Orthodox world, we are increasingly witnessing a wave of neoconservatism that permeates all levels and structure of ecclesiastical life and is defined by different and sometimes contradictory tendencies, such as the strengthening of fundamentalist groups, the idolization of charismatic elders, the increasing clericalization of church in combination with an unjustified and untheological enhancement of its institutional elements, the questioning of the achievements of modernity, but also the questioning of science itself, as it has become evident during the pandemic crisis. The victim of this neoconservative campaign is theology itself, which is either scorned or devalued, or becomes an uncritical apologist of a hierarchical ecclesiology, or even a servant of the supremacy of monasticism and its claim of representing the universal model of spiritual life. Therefore, the partial character of monasticism becomes universal and is presented as the sole authentic model of ecclesial life that is imposed on married believers and their families and parishes. As Dr. Konstantinos Delikonstantis, Professor Emeritus of the Theological School of Athens and currently Director of the First Patriarchal Office at the Ecumenical Patriarchate in the Fana, however, significantly notes, open quote, if the work of the theologian has a seal of the church, it does not mean that it serves uncritically this particular ecclesiastical community. Academic theology is neither a sermon nor a religious propaganda. It is completely unreasonable for theology to be scientific and at the same time to be close to itself, reproducing its own tradition. Actually, theology is a critical dialogue partner of the church. It represents a critical theory of Christianity, not only in its Orthodox version, but also in the Roman Catholic and Protestant one. End of quote. These bold statements by the professor and associate of the Ecumenical Patriarch are clearly opposed to the strong clericalist tendency of Orthodox theology today, a tendency that implies both the ideological control over theology and the growing trend of substituting lay theologians with clerics, and mostly bishops and metropolitans. It will be enlightening to take a look at the major conferences of Orthodox theology organized by the schools of theology that confirm our above statement. In the First Congress of Orthodox Theology in Athens in 1936, a conference that marked the celebrated return to the Fathers, only one bishop out of 27 speakers had participated. The Second Congress, held again in Athens in 1976, had 7 bishops as speakers out of a total of 53 speakers. At the Thessaloniki Congress in 2018, dedicated to the Holy Great Council, a congress that was supposed to continue the aforementioned theological gatherings, 12 out of 15 keynote speakers were bishops or metropolitans, most of them with minimal theological research. This tendency clearly shows 2 things. First one, bishops or priests and monks accordingly are the only bearers of ecclesiastical and theological truth, and that B, this truth is expressed univocally and exclusively in a specific way that does not leave almost no room for unity within diversity. Moreover, this tendency nullifies any possibility for discussing the theologoumena, which traditionally safeguarded a sense of openness in orthodoxy, since the rule that had prevailed over time argued that apart from topics related to the Trinitarian or the Christological dogma, Anything else could be considered as theologumenal. For example, birth control or the sexual life of a couple. In relation to point A, apart from the hierarchical tradition that has deep roots in the Orthodox tradition, in relation with the aforementioned, it should also not be neglected a certain understanding that has prevailed in recent decades in the Greek Orthodoxy, in particular, according to which theology should be enchurched, that is connected with the monastic life, the altar, and the priesthood. According to this view, theology has to be released from the domination of lay academic theologians that Babylonian captivity to the West transmitted to us in line with the spirit of Protestantism. Leading Greek theologians such as Christos Giannaras have not ceased to support similar views in their books and articles throughout the 1970s and even beyond. For example, Giannaras's book, Orthodoxy and the West, Hellenic Self-Identity in the Modern World, which was first published with a different title in 1972 and has been republished and updated in extended version 1992, is full of similar views, such as the rediscovery of the authentic Orthodox theological ethos and the liberation from Western influences go hand in hand with the reconnection of Orthodox theology with monasticism and priesthood, while doing theology by lay theologians is directly related to Protestant and Western influences in general. Nowadays, after the experience of what actually the churching of theology means, and after refuting many of the mirage cultivated by the famous return to the fathers, the demand for a theologizing church, combined with a timeless demand for the participation of the laity in the church life, especially women, along with a genuine synodal spirit, which will permeate and infuse all levels of ecclesial life, parishes, dioceses, archdioceses, and even patriarchates, imperatively and vertically never before. In relation with point B, the supporters of a univocal orthodoxy seem to have found the theological alibi in the now widespread, thanks to the theology of Father John Romanidis, view of a patristic fundamentalism, combined with a mythological and ahistorical understanding of the fathers. Romanidis boldly sees on the univocal character in both the expression and the content of the patristic theology, considering any discussion about different schools and currents within this theology as a heresy, and interpreting according to the ideological criteria the abundant patristic evidences. Furthermore, the particular historical circumstances in which the patristic works were written, the fathers' continuous interaction and dialogue with philosophy and outside philosophical trends of their era, their study and free use of the hermeneutical methods of their time. All this has been forgotten by the neoconservative revival. And we have not yet adequately considered what appears to be the most characteristic example of the church taking up elements initially foreign to its own theological and ontological assumptions and fruitfully assimilating them into its life and theology. But this ahistorical approach to patristic theology is in fact a betrayal of the spirit of the fathers, inasmuch as it betrays and ignores the very core and essence of their thought. It is a continuous dialogue with the world, an encounter with an assumption of the historical, social, cultural, and scientific context of their time, as is particularly well illustrated by the great 4th century fathers' engagement with Hellenism and their studies, philosophical studies, in the Athens school and other centers of the back then dying ancient world. Patristic evidences, as for example the ones by St. Gregory of Thaumaturgus and St. Gregory of Nazianzus, confirm the legitimacy of theological pluralism and dialogical ethos as expressed in the inaugural verse of the letter to the Hebrews, according to which, open quote, in many and various ways, God spoke to our ancestors in faith, end of quote. The gospel was preached and embodied in a diverse, pluralistic, and ecumenical environment. Unfortunately, modern orthodoxy often tends to replace theological pluralism with all kinds of monophonic versions. Orthodoxy seems to be particularly open to entitlement. Therefore, Orthodoxy's legitimate and traditional theological pluralism, its unity in diversity, has thus been replaced in many cases by spiritual uniformity and a theological entrapment in a single term in a homogeneous expression. Unfortunately, these nice theological words do not on pluralism and diversity do not represent the ecclesial and theological reality of our time, as evident from the exceptionally interesting previous speeches. A reality that, with the exception of Greece and the United States, Greece to a certain extent, is distinguished by the lack of academic freedom and job security. For the past 4 to 5 years, the situation seems to be even more depressing with regards to the Orthodox theological schools in the Balkans, Southern Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Russia is another, even more difficult case, as it was discussed by Inga Leonova. An even more flagrant case is that of the once promising Belgrade Theological School, where an unprecedented wave of persecution and expulsion of academic theologians from the university has taken place, while in other cases, such as those of Romania, but also against Serbia, the church hierarchy disposes of a particular Orthodox missio canonica, mostly due to its privileged relation with the state, which allows the church to impose its views to the secular legislature and thus demand to have the exclusive right to approve the participation of academic theologians in conferences, radio, panels, TV shows. Furthermore, the ecclesial hierarchy does not hesitate to ask for having the control of the paper to be presented in conferences. That was also explained by Dr. Biliot, initiating for the first time a peculiar orthodox imprimatur and nihil obstat. These practices were relevant only to the Roman Catholic Church up to the Second Vatican Council, and then they were abandoned. Variations or attempts to imitate these extreme measures are more or less found in Russia and maybe Bulgaria and Lebanon. The curtain has removed, and the grim reality of the Orthodox Church and theology is unfolding before the eyes of the astonished audience. The serious, long-term, unresolved issues of orthodoxy with modernity and with what the last brings, such as autonomy of the subject, freedom of expression, respect for diversity, human rights, etc., can no longer be hidden or ignored. It is time to discuss them and theologically evaluate them. It is urgent for the Orthodox to rediscover the value of legitimate theological pluralism and also of dialogue itself and dialogical theology. Orthodoxy today is called to elaborate and formulate a theology of otherness and identity. The latter, in a broader and more eschatological perspective, encompasses otherness too, as, quoting John Zizioulas, the other becomes an ontological part of one's identity, and otherness is not a threat to unity, by sine qua non condition of it, to the extent that otherness is constitutive of unity and not consequent upon it. To recall the words of Metropolitan John Zizioulas. The whole atmosphere of persecution and lack of freedom to which I have briefly referred, both me and the colleagues, is not unrelated to some form of moral panic that distinguishes many Orthodox, both clergy and laity. The more the secular pluralistic societies in which we live are liberalized and modernized, the more churches adopt authoritarian standards and models, resigning from any attempt for dialogue and theological evaluation of liberal democracy, along with the social and cultural changes it brings. But a church that does not dialogue with the world and its problems, that does not converse with the otherness of the other, essentially ceases to function as ecclesia, since it denies the most important consequence of the incarnation, the recapitulation of the whole of creation in Christ, that is, the reception and transformation of the created by the uncreated, the assumption in the person of the incarnate Son and Word of God of all human nature in history. Besides, we should always remember that there is no genuine theology apart from freedom. While we are invited to reflect on the fact that serious theological reflection mainly flourished in secularized societies, such as France and the US, and almost never in authoritarian traditional societies or in religious states. The example of the Russian emigre theology seems to confirm this paradoxical claim. It is not by chance that the diaspora theology has first given its fruits in France and then later in the US, in other words, in the most secularized places on the planet. Despite this depressing overview of the reality I briefly described above, we need to discuss without eluding ourselves. We hope that today's roundtable will help you understand the problems and protect the threatened academic freedom of Orthodox theologians. Thank you very much for your participation.
Many thanks, dear Pandelis, for your insightful thoughts. Now we have 30 to 40 minutes for a discussion. So you are kindly requested, those who are following this panel, to ask questions, to contribute comments.
I see a question and Q&A from Paula, two questions actually from Paula Desir to me and to Ionut.
Okay, so please go ahead. I don't see them, but please go ahead.
Hi, Paul. Okay, so the question is, during the late Soviet period, the Russian Orthodox Church joined the state in persecuting dissident priests, notably Dmitry Dudko, Nicholas Eshliman, and Gleb Yakunin. Can you compare Russian Orthodox Church's involvement in the current persecution of clergy and theologians with that of the ROC in the late Soviet period? Paul, thank you. This is an excellent question. I think that the answer is twofold. On one hand, the Church, Russian Orthodox Church, is doing what it has always been doing, which is cooperating with the state authorities in the persecution of the those who are somewhat dissident. But I would say that the situation now is considerably worse because if before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the church could claim that it was laboring under pressure from the godless authorities, it has no excuses anymore. So it is supporting the regime and acting as its willing ideological partner and a partner in persecution of its own volition. I would remind to everyone that Patriarch Kirill is a very consistent defender of the idea that Russia is a country where the symphonia between church and state, as he says, that was dreamed about by the Byzantines, has been realized. He first talked about it in 2000. Well, he talked about it several times, but one of the notable examples was in 2009 when he talked about striving for the symphonia, comparing the state and the church to heaven and earth that have to act in harmony for the betterment of humanity. And very recently, in April of this year, he gave an interview in which he said that the symphonia has been achieved, that Russia is the country which realized the dream of the Byzantines. He called Russia the island of freedom, which is a Freudian slip, because island of freedom is what the Soviet Union called communist Cuba, the island of freedom in the Western world. And the reason he says that the Byzantines have only dreamed of it and Russia realized it is because, according to Kirill, in Byzantine Empire, the emperor claimed authority over the church, whereas in modern Russia, the church is a fully free partner of the state. So, going back to your question, I think that the activity is the same, the excuse is being removed. Now the church is acting of its own volition.
Thank you, Paul, for your question. I will read it for everyone. How did the current heavy hand of the Romanian church affect Romanian participation in the January conference of IOTA in Volos? Does this heavy hand extend to Romanian theologians abroad, several of whom participated in Volos? To respond to your first question, I don't have information like they opposed the convention in Volos or they tried to, keep their theologians at home. What they did is somehow discourage any theologian from the theological system in Romania to participate. And thanks to Inga, let us not forget that Patriarch Daniel blessed the publication of Larche's latest book on how to do Orthodox theology, in which most of the Western influences should be disregarded. There should be no contact with modernity, and so on and so forth. What happens in Western Orthodoxy is perceived as a form of neo-Marxism and progressism, and that's it. And there should be no mingling with this kind of tendencies. To respond to the second question, to respond to the second part of the question, let us not forget that the Romanian Orthodox diaspora, for which I have a huge respect, and especially for Metropolitan Joseph of France or for Metropolitan Seraphim of Germany, behaves in a completely different way as the Romanian Patriarchate behaves at home, because I would say the standards are different. These hierarchs of the Romanian Orthodox Church, because they live in diaspora, because they live in the context of consolidated democracies, they learn how democracy actually functions, even in the church. And they learned also on hard way that in order to preserve and have communities in places like France and Germany, they need the support of the laity. So they need to treat theologians and clergymen better. They need to actually function in a certain collegiality, in a certain synodality with other layers of the church. So basically, to respond to your question very short, because I don't want to accaparate the discussion. As far as the Romanian Orthodox community is from the center, the more liberal and the more freedom it will enjoy. It will be, the more liberal it will be, and the more freedom it will enjoy. Thank you.
Sorry, just to add one element of information as a kind of information, I would say that no one, I underline, no one Orthodox Romanian theologian from Romania itself took part in the IOTA conference in Volos. They took part, Romanians from abroad, but not from Romania itself. And very, very few Serbian theologians took part. You can maybe understand why this, but this is the data of, and everyone who took part in the IOTA conference knew about this. And so no one Romanian theologian and very few Serbian theologians, and these Serbian theologians were treated as traitors. So, thank you.
We should take another thing into account. Have you ever wondered if the Romanian theologians are actually able, intellectually speaking, to participate in such sophisticated debates as those in that IOTA put forward? And I don't want to be ironical here. I'm just asking a question as I see it from the interior, from Romania. Are you sure, are you that sure that Romanian theologians are able to participate with some contribution, of some sort of contribution, to the discussion and to the topics that IOTA raises in contemporary Romanian Orthodox theology? And let's not forget that it also, IOTA took place in January. In Romania, for the Orthodox theologians, they are in the middle of exams, and also they prepare for annual examination. I'm not saying it wasn't a conspiracy organized from the center, or they did not receive some kind of, some kind of advice, parental advice, do not attend. But I think there are a lot of other factors that should be also kept into account. And there is a trend now in Romanian Orthodoxy to discourage theologians at all levels to attend conferences abroad, because the hierarchs have this kind of feeling that when they return home, they return with a Western baggage. They become something like Western theologians rather than Orthodox theologians. I know it sounds silly, I know it's stupid, basically, but this is the perception, why they always discourage their theologians and their professors of theology to attend this kind of meetings. They also think that most of what happens in IOTA, as I said previously, is something dubious. It's something leaning towards the left in terms of ideological terms. So the people from the IOTA are neo-Marxists, they are for, I don't know, this kind of values that will dilute Orthodoxy. And basically that IOTA, it's some kind of an occult conspiracy to somehow dilute the Orthodoxy, or Romanian Orthodoxy at its core. So that's basically how they see things. So this is why I'm not sure that you will have more Romanian theologians for the next edition in Georgia, because the bishops will keep in discouraging attendance. Thank you.
Answer. Are you hearing me? Yeah, I have on my list now Professor Ladouceur, who would like to have the word.
Sorry, just my questions have been answered. It was just to state my questions orally. Thank you very much, Ionut and Inga, for your very detailed answers. Thank you. Very, very informative. Thank you.
Okay. On my list is Nino. Now, Nino, can you please say your question? Can you ask your question?
Good afternoon. Can I speak in Greek?
In Greek. Yes, please.
Μπορούμε να πούμε ότι
Could we say that the enhancement of the role of theologians depends on the empowerment of clerics as well? In my opinion, the role of theologian in our church, especially in terms of academic freedom, is linked to the empowerment of the clergy as well, because
the question is addressed to whom?
It is a general question, anyone can answer. So, is the empowerment of clergy related to academic freedom as well?
Okay, so who would like to answer? Who would like to answer from our panelists?
I would like
Professor Vukomanovic, would you like to say something on this?
Well, I could say a few words about that, and then probably comment on what Ionuț has said about the diaspora theologians in Romania. We have a similar situation in Serbia, but that will be only a couple of sentences. Well, as far as the first issue, I would say that really the structures of ecclesiastical power can exert a sort of epistemological monopoly over the theological field, which is, of course, one of the problems for the development of theology. If those prelates are not theologically educated or do not have the level of sophistication that professors of theology have, then you have a very, very ambiguous situation. The power is used for theoretical purposes or theological purposes, something similar to politburos in Soviet Union, who made some theoretical decisions, as it were, based on Marxist ideology or anything like that. In Serbia, what we have is more a personal attitude towards certain theologians or certain antagonisms that are not so much theological in their character, or not at least primarily theological. We do not have theological disputes. It is more related to certain liberal trends that have appeared recently within the church, some sort of liberal wing, as it were, in the church, and the leaders of that movement are bishops in the diaspora, in the European diaspora, and also in the United States. So interestingly enough, Bishop Maxim, who was also a professor at the Faculty of Theology, was let go from that position as one of those liberal voices from the diaspora. Second example is Bishop Grigoriev from Germany, who is often a target of criticism from high ecclesiastical authorities, and his secretary, Professor Vilotic, was also fired from the Faculty of Orthodox Theology. So there's a clear association between the professorships at the Faculty of Theology in Belgrade and the activities of Orthodox bishops in the diaspora. We could probably mention a couple of more cases, but I just want to sum up that obviously these voices that come from the diaspora Orthodox community, where bishops have contacts with other traditions and have more ecumenical proclivities and engagement, I think are considered or have been considered for a while as a threat to to the domestic ecclesiastical authorities, and they are outspoken. And it is interesting that two of these bishops, also Maxim and Grigory, were the only bishops who did not participate in. Recently in May, there was a Holy Council of Bishops of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and the President of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, invited all the members of the Holy Council to his presidency, and these two bishops did not want to participate. It was a symbolical gesture of rebellion between against this recent symphony between not the state, but the authorities, secular authorities, and also ecclesiastical authorities, who are doing very fine in terms of their mutual relationships, but at the expense of Serbian Orthodox theology in general. Thank you.
Pandelis, thank you very much, Professor Vukomanovic. Pandelis, you wanted to say something on this very issue?
Ναι, δεν είμαι σίγουρος ότι κατάλαβα
καλά. Yes, I'm not sure that I fully understood Nina's question. I think I have the sense. I have the impression that, first of all, let me clarify that I don't want to give you the impression that I am in favor of a conflict between laity and clergy, between monks and lay theologians, but I have the impression that this increase in influence of the clergy and of monks leads to the devaluation of lay theologians. This is why I gave you the example of the Theology Congress in Athens in 1936, 1976, and 2018. They are very indicative of the situation. In Thessaloniki in 2018, out of 15 keynote speakers, 12 were bishops or metropolitans without important, significant theological background and work. This shows a trend for clericalization. And there was something that was not mentioned, and please, note, say it if I'm wrong. For some years in Romanian theological schools, you cannot become a full professor unless you are a member of the clergy. So it is a trend towards clericalization that is based on the applicable legal provisions. How can an EU state such as Romania put up with these practices? And the question or remark that I want to make is that we have now so many examples. All of you talked about these examples. And despite these bipolar of the diaspora and the theologians living inside the country, Serbian diaspora, clergy living inside Serbia. Another important element that will allow us to understand the mapping of Orthodox theology today in traditionally Orthodox countries. So this other element is that whether we're talking about established, stable democracies, consolidated democratic institutions. So are we talking about consolidated democracies or unstable, unconsolidated ones? In Greece, we are still enjoying freedom of theology speech. This is more or less relevant to this peculiar relation between the state and the church, but it is a state that it is mostly European, mostly democratic. And all the people of my generation grew up in a European state with European values, and we live in in freedom we can express our views, we can also express our opposition. There are problems in Greece as well. Clearly, there are problems. Today, a priest was suspended in Athens because he allowed two girls to help to be altar girls. So he was suspended. An exceptional priest was suspended because he allowed altar girls. So there are problems in Greece as well, clearly. But there is a certain freedom and democracy. And another element to be taken into account is that where there is democracy in Greece and the US, things are better. Where democracy is unstable, is unconsolidated, is problematic, then it is much more common to have a church that is more arbitrary. So in Romania and in Serbia, to a different extent, we are in this state of lack of complete democracy or consolidated democracy. I believe that Orthodox lay theologians feel asphyxiated in cases of clericalization or when the monasticized spirit prevails in church. That's my answer, if I understood Nino's question.
Just to yes, you got my question right. That's what I meant, that lay theologians need to enjoy more academic freedom without having to bear the full burden, without having for the clergy to bear the full burden. That's what I meant. And of course, I don't want to devaluate the members of the clergy. We just want to have a balance, the right balance. Thank you so much, Mr. Kalaitzidis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A comment has been done by Father Brandon Gallagher, and Inga would like to react. But first of all, I would ask Father Gallagher if he's still with us to raise his to formulate his question or his remark, his comment, actually, to say it orally.
Yes. So I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you all for this very illuminating and quite thorough kind of touch across the Orthodox world. I think there's been a lot of focus obviously on the Russian situation because it's in the news. But what we've seen, I know about the Greek situation because Pantelis is a friend and colleague. But I was very, very happy to hear about, well, happy is not the right word, but I was grateful to hear about the Romanian and Serbian situation. So what this seems to point, and it would be interesting to have somebody deal with the so-called diaspora, is that this is something which is universal, this type of authoritarianism, and and the result being a type of Orthodox theology which certainly doesn't allow for lay voices, but silences indeed anybody who is attempting to allow a type of creativity, a type of dialogue, a type of interaction with the modern world. So this is something which is true. But I would here push back a little bit and say, well, is this really just the triumph of a type of monastic spirit, the fetishizing of, the role of the hierarch, a kind of hatred of pluralism, a hatred of secularity and of the modern world? Or are these things perhaps symptomatic of something more profound? So if we look in this century from the first Congress, which Pantelis pointed out, what we see is, the growth of something like a modern creative Orthodox theology across the world, and liberation from being sort of under various different dominant authorities, whether that was in the case of the Russian imperial kind of system, or then later, obviously, under the Soviet system, or the remnants of the Ottoman world. But what we also see is the growth of ecclesiological and Eucharistic thinking becoming really center to all different forms of Orthodox theology. The person who obviously best expresses this is the late Metropolitan John of Pergamon, although he was building on the thought of his teacher, Florovsky, and you find this theology in many different Orthodox theologians, including Father Staniloae. So what I want to say is something more challenging that maybe the speakers can respond to. Is it perhaps that what they're reacting to is due precisely to our focus on communion, and communion understood wrongly as unanimity? So in this vision of communion, the vision that we see in most forms of Eucharistic ecclesiology, the bishop is at the heart. And he is the one who, as it were, is the symbol of unity, and the people of God center around him, and their life is in Christ through him as a sort of mediator. So this is the question then. Is it the very thing that is our glory that is also the thing which holds us back? And that therefore, if we are to have a new approach to Orthodoxy in the modern world and to any number of different issues, we need a new being as communion, a new communion ecclesiology, with it a new vision of the people of God and the hierarchy. So it's a bit of a question which is unusual, but yeah, thank you so much for all of you in your work.
Well, unusual and provocative. Inga Leonova, you wanted to react. Your microphone.
Sorry. Okay, first of all, thank you, dear Father Brendan, and congratulations on your ordination. Very happy about that. I think that you're hitting a bullseye with this comment and this question, in my opinion, because I think that there is a profound misunderstanding of what the unity in communion means, and I would dare say that it is a function of the and maybe this will sound a little snobbish, I apologize for that, but it's a function of the lack of sophistication education that is becoming, for some reason, more and more widespread in the hierarchy. And what I mean by that is that when we say in the liturgy that we confess with one mind, right? Let us with one mind we may confess. We are that does not turn us into that's not meant to turn us into the sort of clones of a set of opinions that tolerate no challenge, no creativity, no question, and no development. What we are, I think, what we're talking about Eucharistically is that is really espoused in the Creed and in our confession of the Trinity and the incarnation of Christ, and this. And I think that this fear of challenge perhaps is a symptom of the lack of understanding of what the complexities of our theology mean, and especially how we can deal with modernity. you know, one of the things that I think a lot of us encounter is this rather idiotic dialogue when an issue comes up, somebody tells you can't talk about it because there's an Orthodox opinion on the matter, an established Orthodox opinion. You ask, well, what is the opinion? You know, you get a response and you say, well, it's not quite like that. This father said that, this father said this theologian said that, and then your interlocutor becomes very agitated and says, well, you know, you're just making trouble. And I think that this is a great violation of what I personally understand as a patristic spirit, which is the spirit of discourse, challenge, and continuing discovery. I think that's and the spirit of the respect for the Holy Spirit's action in the church as it continues its sojourn in the world.
Thank you. Pandelis, if I see well, there existed a question addressed to you concerning St. John of Damascus.
Yes, and I would like to comment a little bit
you need
on,
to consult your chat.
On Brandon Gallagher's question or remarks. First of
Father Gallagher's.
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, dear Brandon, dear Father Brandon, congratulations on your ordination. Axios, as we say in Greek. Many good wishes for your diaconia, for your priestly service. So I think Brandon's question or remarks are really profound, and we need to think about it, and we need to reflect about it. And I don't think that we can offer an answer immediately. So I would only like to say that already Inka said something about this, that to my understanding, the problem is not so much with Eucharistic ecclesiology or Eucharistic theology or communion ecclesiology. To my understanding, as for years now I used to say, the main problem is our pending relationship with modernity. This is really a topic we should work and we should reflect and discuss on. And the second point, as you know, for years now, I claim that there is a problem, there is a real problem of patristic fundamentalism, and there is a real problem of the Orthodox referring always to the fathers and trying to find any kind of answer, every answer about any kind of question to the fathers. This is a kind of identity policy for us, the way we understood patristic theology during the whole of the 20th century in many cases was a kind of identity mark. So again, behind this is our relationship with the West. To my understanding, these are the main reasons for the situation we face today. But again, the answer by Brandon, the question to, the answer to the question asked by Brandon Gallagher needs to be more further reflected. I'm not able to provide more answers today. So now there is a question about St. John Damascus, but I don't see this question. It disappeared from. Do you have the question, please, about?
Yeah. The question is, well, I'm trying to. I would be trying to summarize the question in my own words. The question was, you spoke about how the church fathers related to philosophy and to education. What do you think about the synthesis made by St. John of Damascus in his Summa Theologica between theology and philosophy? Something like that.
Yeah, I would say this is a very good remark, actually, very good question, because it gives me the opportunity to say something about St. John Damascus. Usually, from what we keep from St. John Damascus is his famous saying, I will just repeat, I will not say anything from my own, I will just repeat the previous fathers, the previous church tradition. And I would say that in saying this, we didn't pay so much attention. In saying this, St. John Damascus initiated or inaugurated a quite new way to make theology and to make the exposition of Orthodox theology. Many of his works, like, for example, his exposition of Orthodox faith, which is a kind of summa theological, it's kind of Orthodox summa, are quite unknown to the previous patristic tradition. So, or his way he approaches philosophy, or his way in dealing with philosophical categories, like in his work Dialectica, are not the usual ones in the patristic tradition. So, yeah, St. John Damascus is a good example of fidelity to the tradition and renewal of fidelity of tradition and how to say, in today's terms we would say modernity, but of course in his time it was not question about modernity. So and in this way I think St. John Damascus could inspire Orthodox theologians to take the next step and to try to formulate theological truths in the today intellectual and spiritual context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is one more hand. Theophilos, I think, would like to ask a question.
Ναι, θα μιλήσω στα ελληνικά.
Yes, I will speak in Greek. Unfortunately, we cannot hear Theophilos.
We are not hearing you.
Ακούγομαι τώρα?
Σας ακούμε τώρα. Now we are hearing you.
Yes, thank you very much. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ.
First of all, I'd like to thank all speakers. I was truly astonished by what I heard, especially the cases of Serbia and Romania. I was not aware of them. I'd like to ask a question to all three speakers from Serbia, Romania, and Russia mainly. After first making a small comment on what Pantelis said, I'm talking about the case of the Greek priest that was suspended. I read in social media that his issue is going to be discussed in the next Holy Synod, standing Holy Synod, maybe next week. What I'm afraid of, really afraid of, is that the decision of the standing Holy Council will be unjustified, meaning that they will express a view.
Αλλά φοβούμαι ότι δεν θα
my fear is that they will not provide any strictly theological justification on their decision.
Δυσκολία να εφαρμοστεί κάτι τέτοιο, στο ότι
they will talk about confusion, the difficulty, the contradiction to tradition, etc., etc. Of course, this reflects the situation in Greece, other than what has already been heard. In my personal view, the Greek hierarchy is cut off the ecclesiastic body. They're just trying to keep balances
πολιτικά φόρα, είτε με διάφορα
with political fora or fundamentalistic fora in the same social media, I read that we are at a point in Greece.
Στο σημείο στην Ελλάδα, ελάχιστοι άνθρωποι οι οποίοι μάλλον...
Very few people, probably fundamentalists, determine the agenda of the debate and the nature of the appearance of church, asking, exercising pressure on it. I believe the hierarchy of the church might even be afraid of these people. So my question is the following.
Δηλαδή, ο απλός χριστιανός...
What is the view, the position of the flock in your country? Meaning believers, how do they react to this situation? Because I imagine that in Greece and in other countries as well, if the flock in general, and not just only certain fundamentalistic milieus were to express their view, maybe the church hierarchy would act differently, would take these views into account. So what does the flock do in your countries? Thank you.
I suggest that Professor Vukomanovic starts, and then I will give the floor to Professor Bliuta.
Thank you. Well, as far as the flock, I would say in Serbia, most of the flock, they do not even understand what's going on in terms of the relations between the church and the theological faculty. I would like to emphasize even that the university community, my community of the University of Belgrade, do not understand enough the gravity of that situation. I would dare to say that at least 50% of professors and members of the University of Belgrade still think that the Faculty of Orthodox Theology is under the jurisdiction of the Serbian Orthodox Church, as was the case during the socialist period. It ended in 2004, but I still think that they do not understand this kind of new arrangement, that the Faculty of Theology, of Orthodox Theology, is a state faculty within the State University of Belgrade. The resistance of the University of Belgrade is another curious matter in this regard, because we did not hear much voices when the new law on higher education was passed that clearly violated the major category of autonomy of university. There were no initiatives to assess this legal issue before the Constitutional Court, for example. My faculty, the Faculty of Philosophy, reacted. We, even during the preparation of the law, the first drafts of the law, we reacted and made our objections. We referred to the unconstitutional character of the new law. The university community in general was pretty silent about that. And I would say, to make this very succinctly, the problem in Serbia is the politicization of religion and church, in particular the Serbian Orthodox Church. The new liaison between the state authorities, very authoritarian regime of Aleksandar Vučić, and on the other hand, the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is presided now by a new, younger patriarch who is in very good relations with the current president of Serbia. So we have the problem of authoritarianism on both sides, and I would say that it's mainly a political issue. We do not have so much theological problems. We have very similar problems as far as the citizens of Serbia and the flock of the Serbian Orthodox Church, who are also the citizens of Serbia, of course. It's authoritarianism, it's politicization of the ecclesiastical field. And whenever you have politicization of any religious institution, you have it's necessarily, the result is its desacralization. In other words, Politics is not a good friend, especially the secular politics and agendas to any church whatsoever. This is what's going on in Serbia. Unfortunately, a lot of ignorance, as Professor Pantelis has already mentioned, the deficiency of democracy, the lack of the rule of law, democratic political culture contributes to this entire scheme. So as far as Serbia is concerned, this is what's currently going on. Hence, the resistance of the citizens of Serbia in recent days and weeks. About 50,000 citizens are protesting against the government, against the violence in the public sector, violence in the media, violence in the parliament, violence all over the country that very recently entered the elementary schools, where we had mass shootings for the first time in the Serbian history. This is all part of the political and social process and the degradation that is unfortunately going on in my country.
Thank you very much. Professor Biliuta, very briefly, please.
I will just have to say two things. The situation in Romania of Romanian Orthodox communities is pretty much the same as in Serbia, with only two aspects that make the Romanian case exceptional. The first is that most of the members of the Romanian communities are actually belonging to the communities without actually believing in the Orthodox values. They exercise their faith in the virtue of tradition rather than knowing what they are doing. And the second, in what concerns academic education, theological education, in Romania, the majority of the members of the community, the flock, still considers that in order to become a priest, a certain candidate should pursue a theological education at the high school level. They don't even, a seminary, to pursue a seminary education. They don't even know that actually someone to become a priest needs an university education. So basically, most of the members of the community are unaware of the fact that the Romanian Orthodox Patriarchate and the Romanian state co-sponsor 16 departments of Orthodox theology spread across Romania. Last but not least, I would say that this whole dilemma, this whole issue of, I would say, containing academic freedom should be also interpreted as a sign of secularization of the Romanian Orthodox Church, and not just the Romanian Orthodox Church, I will dare to say all the churches in Eastern Europe. And one of the first signs of secularization at the core of the church is this institutionalization, of this over-institutionalization, this over-clericalization, this, I would say, this emphasis placed on the control and the strict, tight-knit hierarchical shaping of the church. Thank you so much.
Are you hearing me? Because I have connection problems.
Sorry, I can't hear. We can't hear.
Yeah, Assad, I hear you, but I don't know the other people.
I hear you.
Thank the Voros Academy for organizing this panel, to thank the participants, and especially to thank the speakers. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Okay. Panderi.
Did you finish, Assad?
You would like to say something?
Yeah, I would like to close. Θα ξαναμιλήσω ελληνικά. Θα ήθελα να
I will
ευχαριστήσω
speak in Greek now.
όλους τους
I
ομιλητές
would like to thank all the speakers,
της
and I would
απόψινής
also like to thank the moderator of today's panel. From what we have heard, you realize how difficult this discussion is and how imperative the need to hold such discussion is, because it's not easy to find speakers from Russia, Romania, Serbia in order to talk about these issues. So I would like to warmly thank all the speakers and the moderators of this panel.
Οι παρεμβάσεις αυτές πρέπει να
It is
κυκλοφορήσουν.
obvious that those interventions need to be broadly and publicly available. As of tomorrow or in 2 days maximum, this video will be available on YouTube, and it would be useful if we have the intervention text published, and that's what we will try to ensure. I would also like to thank our interpreters for allowing us to communicate with each other, and I would like to remind you that the latest event of this year's Time for Action events will be held on Wednesday, June 21st at 7 p.m. in Athens. It will be organized in a hybrid way, both with physical presence, and it will also be streamed online. Theology of religions in the Orthodox Christianity and Islam. And we will have 2 speakers, Thanasis Papathanasiou, who's director of the Synexus Journal, and he's also an alternate professor of missionary at the Academy of Athens, and Miss Naila Tabara. She's the president of the Andean Institution and professor of Islam Studies at Saint Joseph University at Lebanon. And I will be the moderator of this very interesting panel. Like I said, this will be streamed online, and also those of you who are in Athens, of course, you are more than welcome to join us. The languages of the event will be Greek and English, and let's hope that we'll be able to have you with us in this latest event in Athens. Thank you again. I'd like to thank all the people here from the Academy, Panagiotis Theodosiou and Valila Yanutaki, for ensuring the smooth organization of this event, Mr. Trigiannakis for the communication. I'd like to thank all participants. Let's hope that we will be able to witness better days with your contribution for the Orthodox theology. Thank you. Good night.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Καλή νύχτα.
Καληνύχτα.